In 1976, in a small garage in California, two young dropouts, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, were working on something nobody asked for, but everybody needed. Steve Wozniak was the engineer, a genuine genius who could look at a circuit board the way a musician looks at sheet music. On the other hand, Steve Jobs was visionary. He couldn't do what Wozniak does, but can see something Wozniak don't. At the time, computers were massive, expensive machines that only companies and research labs could access. But Steve Jobs saw that ordinary people would one day want one of these things sitting in their home. To afford the parts, Steve Jobs sold his Volkswagen van and Steve Wozniak sold his HP calculator. With that sacrifice, they built the first 50 units by hand on the garage floor. Then, a local computer shop placed an order for all 50 units, and just like that, Apple became a real business. And they called that product the Apple I. By the time the Apple II launched in 1977, they had real demand, real momentum, and a product that was genuinely better than anything else on the market at that price. Schools and small business owners started buying them. Sales went from $7 million in 1978 to $117 million just 2 years later. In 1980, Apple went public on the stock market. By 1983, Apple was one of the fastest-growing companies in American history. Jobs was on the cover of magazines. The whole world was watching. And Steve Jobs, never a man who thought small, wanted to build something that would change computing forever. He called it the Macintosh. He poured everything into the Macintosh, and on January 24, 1984, he walked on stage and introduced it to the world. To announce it, Apple aired a commercial during the Super Bowl, directed by Ridley Scott, that ran exactly once on national television and is still talked about today as the greatest advertisement ever made. The Macintosh was groundbreaking, but it had problems. It was underpowered, it was expensive, and sales started to disappoint. The board was losing patience, and Jobs, who was brilliant but notoriously difficult to work with, had already made enemies inside the company he founded. In 1985, Apple's board sided with CEO John Sculley, a man Jobs himself had hired, and stripped Jobs of his responsibilities. A few months later, Steve Jobs walked out of Apple entirely, got fired from the company he created in that garage. And without him, Apple was about to lose its way completely. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Apple released product after product that went nowhere. The Newton, a handheld device meant to recognize your handwriting, was supposed to be the future. It barely worked. People mocked it publicly, and it became a symbol of everything Apple was getting wrong. Meanwhile, Microsoft was quietly eating Apple's lunch. Windows was getting better, PCs were getting cheaper, and businesses across the world were choosing Microsoft without even thinking twice. Apple's market share was shrinking every single year, and there was no sign of it stopping. The stock hit a 12-year low. Analysts were openly asking whether Apple would survive. Some were predicting the company would be bankrupt within months. But then, at the very last moment, Apple made one phone call that changed everything. In 1996, desperate for a new operating system to replace their aging software, Apple went looking for a solution. The engineers inside Apple knew the truth, even if the executives didn't want to admit it. They couldn't build it themselves. They needed to buy it from someone else, and they had eye on a company called Next. And Next was founded by a man Apple knew very well, a man they had pushed out the door 11 years earlier, Steve Jobs. Apple paid $429 million to acquire Next, and with that deal, they also got Steve back. He came back quietly at first, just as an advisor with no official title, but everyone in every meeting room knew who the most powerful person in the building was. The current CEO at the time, Gil Amelio, was trying to hold things together, but the company was still hemorrhaging money, and the board was out of patience. In July 1997, the board removed Amelio and turned to Jobs. Jobs looked around at what Apple had become and didn't hide his reaction. He was angry. There were 30 product lines. Nobody could explain what most of them were for. Costs were out of control, and the brand that once meant something special had become completely forgettable. What he did next, nobody inside Apple was prepared for. In 1998, Jobs took the stage and showed the world what all of this had been building towards. A computer unlike anything anyone had seen before. It came in a single translucent blue shell, the monitor and the computer built into one beautiful object. He called it the iMac. It sold 800,000 units in its first 139 days. The comeback was real. The company was breathing again. But Jobs wasn't close to done. He had already started thinking about something much bigger than a computer, something that was about to put Apple in the pocket of every single person on the planet. By the late 1990s, music was in chaos. Napster had arrived, and tens of millions of people were downloading songs for free off the internet. The music industry was furious, but completely powerless to stop it. They were suing teenagers. Nothing was working. People had discovered they could get music for free, and they were never going back. Jobs watched all of this and saw an opportunity. People clearly wanted their music digitally, and they wanted to carry it with them. In October 2001, Apple released the iPod. It was a small white device that could hold 1,000 songs in your pocket. In 2003, he did something even more impressive than building the iPod. He sat down with every major record label in the world and convinced them one by one to license their music to Apple. On April 28, 2003, the iTunes Music Store opened. You could buy any song for 99 cents. In the first week, they sold millions. The music industry couldn't believe what they were seeing. But what people didn't fully appreciate at the time was what Jobs had actually built. It wasn't just a music player and a music store. It was a glimpse of something much larger, a device in your pocket connected to a store in the cloud where you could buy things instantly. He had built the blueprint for something that was about to become the most important product in the history of consumer technology. He just hadn't told anyone yet.